One night, my father stood up in the middle of a family celebration, looked directly at me, and said 6 words that erased my entire life. "You are not a Madden. Get out." 11 minutes earlier, everyone in that room had been raising their glasses to celebrate my future as a doctor. So how did a proud family dinner turn into the moment I was disowned? And why did a lawyer show up at my door 2 weeks later, demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars? My name is Geneva Madden, and at the time this happened, I was 28 years old and had just graduated from medical school. I'm telling you this story not because it's dramatic, although it certainly is, but because sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the same people who will destroy you the moment you stop living the life they planned for you. If you've ever felt trapped by expectations, if you've ever felt like your family loved the version of you they imagined more than the real person you are, then you might understand why the night I walked out of that house with one suitcase changed everything about my life. But to understand how it all fell apart, you first have to understand what the Madden name meant where I grew up. In Boston, the Madden name wasn't just a family name, it was an institution. My grandfather founded Madden Ellsworth Medical Center in 1952. It started as a modest hospital but grew into one of the most respected medical institutions in the city. 6 floors, hundreds of beds, and a cardiac wing with my grandfather's name engraved in bronze letters so large you could read them from the street. In our family, medicine wasn't just a profession, it was an identity. By the time I was 8 years old, I could recite the family history the way some kids memorize bedtime stories. My grandfather built the hospital. My father expanded it. My mother ran the foundation that funded its research programs and scholarships. The expectation was simple. The next generation would continue the legacy. And for most of my life, that meant me. My father, Dr. Vincent Madden, was chief of cardiothoracic surgery at the hospital. To people outside our family, he was brilliant. A surgeon other doctors trusted with the most complicated cases. The kind of physician who published research papers, spoke at international conferences, and sat on hospital boards. At home, he was something else entirely. He believed in discipline, perfection, reputation. Mistakes were unacceptable. Weakness was embarrassing, and failure, especially public failure, was unforgivable. My mother, Diane, came from the Ellsworth side of the hospital's name. Old Boston money, philanthropy, charity galas, endowment funds worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every year, she organized fundraising events that attracted donors, politicians, and influential doctors from across the country. To the outside world, my parents looked like the perfect power couple in medicine. Inside our home, love often felt like a performance review. If you succeeded, you were praised. If you disappointed them, silence followed. And silence in our house could last weeks. Growing up in that environment teaches you something strange about love. You learn that love has conditions. You learn that approval must be earned. And you learn that the easiest way to survive is to become exactly the person your parents want you to be. For most of my life, I did exactly that. I studied harder than anyone I knew. I followed the path that had been laid out for me before I even understood what it meant. High grades, prestigious universities, medical school. When I was accepted into medical school, my father told everyone it was the continuation of the Madden legacy. When I graduated 4 years later, in May of 2024, that legacy was supposed to be entering its next chapter. My mother immediately began planning the traditional celebration dinner. In our family, these dinners happened after every major milestone: college graduations, promotions, research awards. They were carefully organized events where family members and professional colleagues gathered to celebrate achievement. This dinner would celebrate my medical degree. The guest list included close relatives, 2 members of the hospital board, and longtime family friends who had watched me grow up. My mother spent weeks preparing everything. The dining room table was polished until it gleamed under the chandelier. The china came out of the cabinet where it was kept for important occasions. Even the seating arrangement had been carefully planned. From the outside, it looked like the proudest moment of my parents' lives. But there was something they didn't know, a secret I had been carrying for months. The truth was, My life had already begun to change long before that dinner, and the biggest change was someone named Ethan Cole. Ethan was an emergency room physician I met during my third-year rotation. He was calm in chaotic situations, the kind of doctor who could intubate a patient in the back of an ambulance without raising his voice. But what mattered more to me was something much simpler. Ethan treated people with kindness. Not the polished politeness that comes from social expectations. Real kindness. The kind that doesn't disappear when nobody is watching. He came from a completely different world than mine. His father had worked in a steel mill. His mother cleaned houses. Everything he achieved in life came from scholarships, military service, and relentless work. If my parents had met him, they would have immediately labeled him unacceptable. So I didn't tell them. For months, I lived two separate lives. One life belonged to Geneva Madden, the daughter of a powerful medical family who attended charity galas and hospital events. The other life belonged to Geneva, a woman sitting on a small couch in Ethan's South Boston apartment, eating takeout pasta and talking about our dreams long after midnight. For a while, I convinced myself those two worlds could exist separately. I believed I could finish medical school, start my residency, and eventually tell my parents about Ethan when the timing was right. But life has a way of forcing truths into the open. In February, I found out I was pregnant. The moment I saw those two pink lines on the test, I knew my life would never be the same. And eventually, my parents would have to know. Which is why, on a warm Saturday evening in June, wearing a navy blue maternity dress that barely hid the small curve of my stomach, I walked up the steps to my parents' house in Beacon Hill. The front door looked exactly the same as it had my entire childhood. Black paint, brass knocker, flower boxes beneath the windows. For 18 years, that house had been the center of my world. But as I stood there, holding my purse and trying to slow my breathing, I had the strange feeling that something inside that house had already changed. My mother opened the door. Her eyes moved immediately to my stomach. For 3 long seconds, she didn't say anything. Then she stepped aside and said quietly, "Everyone is waiting." Inside, 12 people were already seated at the table. Glasses were filled. Conversations stopped when I walked in. My grandfather raised his glass to begin the toast. "To Geneva," he said proudly, "the newest Madden to join the ranks of physicians." Everyone lifted their glasses, and for a moment, I almost believed everything would be okay. But then my father set down his fork. The soft, metallic sound echoed through the room. He looked directly at me. "You've been very quiet tonight," he said calmly. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Is there something you'd like to share with the family?" In that moment, I had two choices. I could lie, or I could tell the truth. So I took a breath, looked around the table at the people who had known me my entire life, and said the words that would end my place in that family forever. "I'm 14 weeks pregnant." The silence that followed my words felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. For a moment, no one moved. My grandfather's glass was still raised halfway in the air, frozen between celebration and confusion. One of the hospital board members cleared his throat awkwardly. My aunt stared at me as if she hadn't heard me correctly. But my father understood immediately. He always did. His eyes moved slowly from my face down to my stomach, then back again, as if confirming what he had suspected the moment I walked through the door. "Pregnant?" he repeated quietly. I nodded once. Yes. That single word seemed to echo across the long mahogany table. Someone shifted in their chair. Someone else set their wineglass down too quickly. The atmosphere in the room had changed so completely that it felt like we were no longer at a celebration dinner, but standing at the edge of some invisible cliff. My father leaned back slightly, folding his hands together. "And the father?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost clinical, the same tone he used when asking a patient about symptoms. But I knew that tone. It was the voice he used when he was about to make a judgment. I swallowed, feeling every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. "His name is Ethan Cole," I said. I forced myself to keep going before fear could stop me. "He's in emergency medicine attending at Boston General. We've been together for a while." I hesitated for a fraction of a second before adding the next part. "We're engaged." That wasn't exactly true. Ethan and I had talked about the future, of course. About living together. about raising the baby, but there had been no formal proposal yet. Still, in that moment, I believed saying the word engaged might soften the blow. I thought it might make the situation sound planned, responsible, acceptable, but instead, the reaction I saw on my father's face was something far colder than anger. Recognition. "Ethan Cole," he said slowly. Then he stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. "The ER physician," he continued. Another pause. "Divorced." His eyes narrowed slightly. "With a child." My heart started beating harder. How did he know that? Then he said the final detail. "From Pittsburgh." A ripple of unease passed through the room. My father looked around the table as if presenting a case. "You see," he said calmly, "this is exactly what happens when people abandon standards." My face grew hot. "Dad." But he raised his hand, cutting me off without even looking at me. "No," he said. "Let's be very clear about this." His voice carried across the entire room. "You are not a Madden." The words hit harder than I expected. Then he said the sentence that ended everything. "Get out." No one spoke. Not my grandfather. Not my aunt. Not the friends who had attended every family holiday for 20 years. No one. I slowly pushed my chair back from the table. For a moment, I thought maybe my mother would say something. Maybe she would calm the situation the way she always did during uncomfortable conversations at charity events. But instead, she leaned forward slightly and spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. "You shamed this family," she said quietly. Her voice was colder than my father's. "We raised a daughter, not a disgrace." My chest tightened. I looked around the table one last time. 12 people, 12 witnesses. Not a single one willing to speak up. My grandfather stared down at his plate, as if studying the pattern on the china. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably but avoided my eyes. The message was clear. No one was going to help me. I glanced at my watch without thinking. 7:01 p.m. I had been sitting at that table for exactly 11 minutes. 11 minutes was all it took to lose my entire family. I turned and walked out of the dining room without another word. My old bedroom upstairs looked exactly the same as it had when I left for medical school. Cream-colored walls. Bookshelves filled with biology textbooks. The desk where I had spent nights studying for the MCAT. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the strange familiarity of the room. Then reality returned. I walked to the closet and pulled out the black Samsonite suitcase I had used since college. I packed quickly. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop, a framed photo of Ethan and me that I had hidden in a desk drawer during previous visits home. And finally, my medical school diploma. It felt strange placing it carefully inside the suitcase. That diploma represented 8 years of work, thousands of hours of study, every sacrifice I had made to become the person my parents wanted. And now it was the only thing I was taking with me when I left their house. 13 minutes later, I carried the suitcase downstairs. The dining room door was closed. I could hear muffled conversation inside, the low hum of voices continuing dinner as if nothing had happened. When I reached the front door, I discovered it was locked. I knocked once. A moment later, the door opened. My mother stood there holding an envelope. Her expression was calm, composed, the same polite mask she wore during foundation galas. She handed me the envelope without a word. Inside was my health insurance card, cut cleanly in half, along with a small handwritten note. "You made your choice. Live with it." I looked up at her. "Mom." "Don't," she said quietly. Her eyes were completely emotionless. "Don't come back. Don't call. And don't embarrass this family any further." Then she closed the door. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. For a few seconds, I simply stood there on the front steps. The night air felt colder than it had earlier. Then I picked up my suitcase, walked to my car, and drove away. I didn't cry until I reached the highway. I drove straight to Ethan's apartment in South Boston. His building was a third-floor walk-up in an older brick complex. The hallway smelled faintly of cooking oil and laundry detergent. Nothing about the place resembled the house I had just left. But when Ethan opened the door and saw me standing there with a suitcase, he didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. He simply pulled me into a hug. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Inside, the apartment was small but warm. A navy blue couch sat in the living room, slightly worn from years of use. Toys were scattered on the floor from Liam's last visit. I sat down on the couch and handed Ethan the envelope. He read the note slowly. His jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he looked at me. "We'll figure this out," he said. I wanted to believe him. But I knew my parents. The silence from them didn't mean the situation was over. It meant they were planning something. And 2 weeks later, I would learn exactly what that was. Because one evening, just as Ethan and I were finishing dinner, someone knocked on the apartment door. When I opened it, a man in a gray suit was standing in the hallway holding a leather briefcase. "Geneva Madden?" he asked. "Yes." He handed me a large envelope. "My name is Douglas Pritchard," he said. "I represent your parents." Then he added something that made my stomach drop. "You're going to want to read this carefully." When the man in the gray suit handed me the envelope, I already had a feeling that whatever was inside would not be good news. Still, nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to read. I closed the apartment door slowly and stood there for a moment, with the envelope in my hands. It was thick, heavy in a way that felt symbolic, as if the weight of it carried more than just paper. Ethan was standing in the kitchen doorway watching me carefully, his expression calm but concerned. "Who was that?" he asked. "A lawyer," I said quietly. "My parents' lawyer." Those words alone were enough to make the room feel colder. I walked over to the small dining table and sat down. For a few seconds, I simply stared at the envelope, tracing the clean printed name across the front. Douglas Pritchard, attorney at law. Then I opened it. Inside were 3 documents, neatly stacked. The first page was titled, "Promissory Note." At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. My eyes moved slowly across the page, reading the formal legal language, trying to make sense of it. Then the number appeared. Arshabawen Mayuan. My breath caught in my throat. According to the document, my parents had loaned me that amount to cover medical school tuition and related expenses over the past 4 years. The loan, it said, was now immediately due, with interest. The total repayment demanded was just over $308,000. Payment deadline, 90 days. My hands started shaking slightly as I turned to the last page. And that's when I saw my own signature. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then, memory came rushing back. 4 years earlier, just before I started medical school, my father had handed me a stack of documents in his office. I remembered standing near his desk while he flipped through the pages quickly. "These are just financial forms," he had said. "Routine paperwork for tuition arrangements." I hadn't questioned him. I trusted him. So I signed everything he placed in front of me. Now I realized what one of those papers had actually been. A loan agreement. One that could legally be used against me. "Geneva?" Ethan said softly. I hadn't realized how pale I had become. I slid the document across the table toward him. He read the first page carefully, his brow slowly tightening. "This can't be real," he said. "Oh, it's real," I whispered. But the promissory note wasn't the worst part. I turned to the second document. This one was a formal demand for repayment. It repeated the same numbers, the same 90-day deadline, and included several paragraphs explaining that failure to repay the loan would result in legal action. That alone would have been terrifying enough. There was no way I could repay over $300,000 in 3 months. I had just graduated medical school. I hadn't even started my residency yet. My savings account contained barely $4,000. But then I reached the third document, and that was the one that truly made my stomach drop. It was labeled Draft Complaint. Not filed yet, but ready. The complaint accused me of financial aid fraud. According to the letter, my parents claimed that when I applied for federal student aid and scholarship programs, I had misrepresented my financial situation. They argued that because my family had the resources to pay for my education, accepting financial aid could be considered fraudulent. If they reported it, the consequences could be devastating. Medical licensing boards take fraud accusations very seriously. Even an investigation could delay my residency. If the accusation stuck, My medical career could be over before it even started. I felt like the room was spinning. "They're threatening to destroy your license," Ethan said slowly. "Yes. And they're using the tuition loan as leverage." I nodded. It was a trap. A carefully constructed, legally airtight trap. My father hadn't simply disowned me in anger. He had prepared for this possibility years earlier. The realization sent a chill down my spine. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the apartment window, traffic moved along the street below. Somewhere in the hallway, a neighbor's television was playing faintly through the wall. Normal life continued. But inside that small apartment, everything had just changed. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's think." His calm voice steadied me slightly. He pulled a chair out across from me and sat down. "First," he said, tapping the promissory note, "we need to verify whether this loan is actually enforceable. My signature is on it." "That doesn't automatically mean everything is valid," he replied. "You signed it under family trust, not as a formal borrower negotiating terms." I appreciated his attempt to stay rational. But deep down, I knew something else. My father didn't make mistakes. If he had prepared this document, it had probably been reviewed by lawyers long before I ever signed it. "They're not just trying to collect money," I said quietly. Ethan looked up. "They want control." The truth of that statement hung in the air between us. My parents weren't simply angry about my pregnancy. They were punishing me for choosing a life they couldn't control. And they were doing it with the same precision my father used in surgery. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. 8 years of studying, hundreds of sleepless nights. Every exam, every sacrifice, all of it suddenly balanced on the edge of a legal threat. For the first time since leaving my parents' house, I felt something close to real fear. "What do we do?" I asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where Liam's drawings were taped to the refrigerator. Colorful crayon pictures of superheroes and dinosaurs. Simple things that reminded me why this situation mattered so much. He turned back toward me. "We fight," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. And hearing those words changed something inside me. Because until that moment, I had been reacting, trying to survive whatever my parents threw at me. But maybe survival wasn't enough. Maybe it was time to start thinking about something else. I looked back down at the documents spread across the table. 3 pieces of paper, 3 threats, 3 attempts to control my future. Then a memory surfaced in my mind. Something small, something I had almost forgotten. For years, while helping occasionally at the hospital foundation during summers, I had seen documents my mother reviewed: financial reports, loan summaries, internal accounting records. At the time, they had seemed unimportant. But suddenly, a quiet thought formed in the back of my mind. What if my parents weren't as careful with their own finances as they were with mine? I opened my eyes again and looked at Ethan. "They think they're holding all the power," I said slowly. He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I replied, "if they're willing to destroy their own daughter to protect their reputation." I paused. "Then maybe their reputation isn't as clean as everyone believes." Ethan studied my face carefully. "What are you thinking?" I folded the documents back into the envelope and placed it on the table. "For now," I said quietly, "I'm thinking we need to start asking questions." Because one thing about growing up in the Madden family had taught me something valuable. Powerful people often believe their secrets are untouchable, and sometimes they're wrong. For the first few days after the lawyer delivered those documents, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the same thoughts kept circling in my mind like a storm that refused to move on. $300,000, 90 days, a threat to my medical license. My parents had somehow turned my entire future into a legal deadline. During the day, I tried to act normal. Ethan still had shifts at the emergency department, and life in his small apartment continued the way life always does: quiet mornings, coffee on the kitchen counter, Liam's drawings still taped to the refrigerator door. But underneath that ordinary routine, a constant tension ran through everything. Because every hour that passed was 1 hour closer to that 90-day deadline. One evening, After Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch with a medical journal still open on his chest, I sat alone at the small dining table again. The same table where I had first opened the envelope from my parents' lawyer. The documents were still there. I had read them so many times that I practically knew every word by memory. But something about the situation still didn't make sense. My father had always been careful, strategic. He didn't make emotional decisions when it came to business or reputation. So if he had decided to attack me legally, it meant one thing: he believed he would win. And that realization bothered me more than anything else. Because if my father felt that confident, it meant he believed I had no way to fight back. I pushed the papers aside and opened my laptop. For the next few hours, I started doing something I hadn't done in years. I started digging. During my teenage years, my mother occasionally brought me to the hospital foundation office during the summer. She said it was good experience, a way for me to learn how the philanthropic side of medicine worked. Most of the time, I simply organized files or carried documents between departments. But sometimes, when no one was watching closely, I would read the financial reports sitting on her desk. At the time, those numbers had meant nothing to me. But now, something about those memories had resurfaced. I opened the public records for the Madden Ellsworth Medical Foundation. Because nonprofit financial reports are technically public information, anyone can look at them. It took a few minutes to find the most recent IRS form. 990 filings. At first, everything looked normal. Annual donations, research grants, community medical programs. Exactly the kind of numbers you would expect from a respected hospital foundation. But then I noticed something strange. A line item labeled Internal Loan Distribution. The number beside it was unusually large. Lo Sharwan Mayuan. My eyes narrowed slightly. Internal loans weren't uncommon for nonprofit foundations. Sometimes organizations temporarily moved funds between departments or short-term programs. But usually, those transactions were clearly documented. This one wasn't. There was no explanation. No listed borrower. Just a number. I scrolled through the report again, this time more slowly. That's when I found another entry. Sishibawen Meiyuan. Also listed under internal loans. Also unexplained. My heart started beating faster. That meant over $1 million had been moved out of the foundation's funds, and there was no public explanation where it had gone. At first, I tried to convince myself it was probably nothing. Accounting adjustments, temporary investments. But the longer I stared at those numbers, the more uncomfortable I felt. Because I had grown up watching my mother review these financial reports obsessively. She was meticulous. She would never allow unexplained transactions to appear in public filings. Unless they were meant to be hidden. The thought sent a chill down my spine. But speculation wasn't proof, and proof was the only thing that mattered. So I closed the financial reports and leaned back in my chair. If there was something suspicious happening inside the foundation, someone else had probably noticed it too, which meant there might be another person out there asking the same questions. For several days, I continued searching quietly. Public filings, old news articles, board member lists. Nothing clearly illegal appeared. Just small irregularities that made me increasingly uneasy. Then, about a week later, something unexpected happened. I received an email. The sender's name was unfamiliar. Patricia Delgado. The subject line read, "We need to talk." At first, I assumed it was spam. But when I opened the message, the first sentence made my stomach tighten. Geneva. I worked as a senior accountant for the Madden Ellsworth Foundation for 6 years. Your name was mentioned recently in connection with a legal issue involving your parents. I read the rest of the email slowly, my pulse quickening with every line. Patricia explained that she had resigned from the foundation 2 months earlier. Officially, she had left for personal reasons. But according to the email, that wasn't the real story. She had discovered financial records that made her uncomfortable. Large transfers, loans that were never repaid, transactions that didn't match the foundation's public reports. And the borrowers listed in those internal documents were 2 names I knew better than anyone. Vincent Madden, Diane Madden. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time. If what Patricia was saying was true, it meant the people accusing me of financial misconduct might have been hiding something far worse. But accusations in an email weren't enough. I needed evidence. I typed a short reply asking if we could meet in person. Her response came less than 10 minutes later. Tomorrow afternoon, Boston Public Library Cafe, 2 p.m. The next day, I arrived early. The cafe was quiet, filled mostly with students and tourists escaping the summer heat. At exactly 2 o'clock, a woman in her mid-40s walked in carrying a laptop bag. She looked around once, spotted me, and approached the table. "You're Geneva," she said. "Yes, I'm Patricia." Her voice was calm but serious. She sat down across from me and opened her laptop bag. Inside was a small black flash drive. She placed it on the table between us. "For years," she said quietly, "I handled internal financial audits for the foundation." My heart began to pound. "And what I found," she continued, "didn't match what the public reports showed." She slid the flash drive toward me. "Those files contain everything I copied before I resigned." "What kind of files?" I asked carefully. "Loan agreements, bank transfers, internal approval forms." Her eyes met mine. "Over $1.2 million in foundation funds." I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "And the borrowers?" I asked. Patricia didn't hesitate. "Your parents." For a moment, the sounds of the cafe faded into the background. Coffee machines, quiet conversations. None of it seemed real anymore. Because suddenly, the situation had shifted in a way I never expected. My parents believed they had complete control over my future. They thought the promissory note and fraud threat would force me to surrender. But now there was something else on the table. Something much bigger than their attempt to intimidate me. Evidence. Real evidence. And for the first time since the lawyer knocked on my door, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Not because I wanted revenge, but because the balance of power was no longer one-sided. I picked up the flash drive slowly. "Why give this to me?" I asked. Patricia looked at me quietly for a moment before answering. "Because powerful people sometimes believe they're untouchable." She paused. "And because someone needs to remind them they're not." I didn't plug the flash drive in right away. For several minutes after Patricia left the cafe, I simply sat there staring at the small black piece of plastic in my hand. It looked ordinary, almost insignificant, but the way she had slid it across the table told me it contained something powerful enough to change everything. Outside the large windows of the Boston Public Library Cafe, the afternoon traffic moved slowly along Boylston Street. Students walked past with backpacks. Tourists took photos of the old stone building. The world looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. But inside my mind, something had shifted. Up until that moment, the entire situation had felt like a trap my parents had carefully designed years in advance. The promissory note, the legal threats, the accusations of fraud, it all pointed in one direction. Control. They wanted me cornered, afraid enough to come back and apologize, desperate enough to accept whatever conditions they decided to impose. But now, sitting there with that flash drive in my hand, I realized something important. Control only works when one side holds all the information. And for the first time since this began, that might no longer be true. I drove home slowly, my thoughts racing the entire way. Ethan was already back from his shift when I arrived. He was in the kitchen, making pasta, still wearing his hospital scrubs, his hair slightly messy from a long day in the emergency department. "You're back early," he said when I walked in. I placed my bag on the table and held up the flash drive. "We need to talk." He studied my expression for a moment and immediately turned off the stove. "What happened?" I told him everything. About the email from Patricia, about the cafe meeting, about the financial irregularities she had discovered inside the Madden Ellsworth Foundation. When I finished explaining, Ethan leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, processing what he had just heard. "Over $1 million?" he said slowly. "At least. And your parents borrowed it from a medical charity foundation? That's what the documents supposedly show." He looked down at the flash drive in my hand. "Have you checked what's on it yet?" I shook my head. "Not yet." For a moment, neither of us moved. Opening that drive meant crossing a line. Up until now, this situation had been about defending myself against my parents' legal attack, But if what Patricia said was true, the files on that drive could expose something much bigger: financial misconduct, possibly even fraud. And if I chose to use that information, there would be no going back. Ethan finally pulled out a chair and sat down beside me. "Let's see what's on it," he said quietly. I nodded and opened my laptop. The flash drive clicked into the USB port with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. For a second, nothing happened. Then a folder appeared on the screen. Inside were dozens of files: spreadsheets, scanned documents, bank transfer confirmations, loan agreements. I opened the first file. It was a detailed spreadsheet listing internal financial transactions from the Madden Ellsworth Foundation over the past 6 years. Two names appeared again and again under the borrower column: Vincent Madden, Diane Madden. My parents. Each entry included dates, amounts, and short descriptions. $300,000 private property investment, $450,000 temporary family loan. O suta shaptezech shichinch, zero capital transfer. My stomach tightened as the numbers added up. $1,27 million. Money that had originally been donated for hospital programs, research grants, and community health care initiatives. And according to the spreadsheet, none of those loans had ever been repaid. "Jesus," Ethan murmured beside me. I opened another document. This one was a scanned approval form bearing my mother's signature. The form authorized the transfer of foundation funds into what was labeled a short-term internal loan. Except the receiving bank account didn't belong to the foundation. It belonged to a private investment account. Another file showed a purchase contract for a lake house in New Hampshire. The down payment had been made 2 weeks after one of the largest foundation transfers. I leaned back slowly, my chest tight. "This is real," I whispered. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, clearly trying to process the scale of what we were looking at. "If these documents are legitimate," he said carefully, "this isn't just unethical." "No," I said quietly. "It's illegal." The room fell silent. For years, my parents had built their public image around integrity and philanthropy. Charity events, scholarship programs, medical outreach initiatives. My mother's speeches about responsibility and generosity had been printed in hospital newsletters. And now, I was staring at documents suggesting that behind the scenes, they had been quietly treating the foundation like a personal bank account. The irony was almost overwhelming. They were threatening to destroy my career over a supposed financial misrepresentation, while they themselves had moved more than $1 million out of a nonprofit organization. Ethan closed the laptop slowly. "So what do you want to do?" That question hung in the air between us, because the answer wasn't simple. Part of me wanted to march straight into the nearest federal office and hand over every document, to expose everything, to show the world the truth about the people who had tried to destroy me. But another part of me hesitated. They were still my parents. Despite everything that had happened, despite the dinner, the legal threats, the trap they had set for me, they were the people who raised me. I sat there quietly for a long time, staring at the closed laptop. Finally, I spoke. "I'm going to give them a chance." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "A chance?" "Yes." I took a slow breath. "They drop the lawsuit, they cancel the debt claim, they leave me alone. And in return, I walk away." Ethan studied me carefully. "And if they refuse?" I looked back at the laptop. "Then I stop protecting them." 2 days later, I sent a short email to the lawyer who had delivered the original documents. The message was simple. I requested a meeting. In person. No court filings yet, no public accusations, just a conversation. The meeting was scheduled for the following week in a conference room inside a downtown office building. When the day arrived, I walked into that room, knowing that everything about my future might be decided in the next hour. My parents were already there. My father sat at the far end of the table, his posture rigid and confident. My mother sat beside him, perfectly composed as always. Their lawyer stood near the window, reviewing a stack of documents. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my father leaned back in his chair. "You finally decided to be reasonable," he said calmly. I placed my bag on the table and slowly removed a folder. "Actually," I replied, meeting his eyes. "I came here to offer you a choice." The lawyer frowned slightly. My mother's expression didn't change. "What kind of choice?" she asked. I opened the folder and slid the first printed document across the table. It was one of the financial spreadsheets from Patricia's flash drive. The room went completely still. My father looked down at the page, then at the next one, then at the bank transfer records beneath it. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty appear on his face. And in that moment, I understood something important. For years, my parents had believed they were untouchable, but now the balance of power had changed, and they knew it. For the first time in my life, I watched my father run out of words. The man who had spent decades commanding operating rooms, board meetings, and entire hospital departments was sitting silently across from me, staring down at the papers I had placed on the table. The room felt unusually quiet. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, people walked through the office lobby, talking on their phones, carrying coffee cups, living ordinary lives. But inside that room, something much larger was happening. My mother picked up one of the documents slowly. Her movements were calm, but I could see the slight tightening around her eyes as she read the numbers. Wire transfers, internal loan approvals, bank account records. Each page was another piece of a story they had assumed no one would ever see. Finally, their lawyer cleared his throat. "Telv, Ms. Madden," he said carefully, "I assume you understand the seriousness of making accusations like this." "I do," I replied calmly. The truth was, my heart was pounding so loudly that I could feel it in my throat. But after everything that had happened, the dinner, the threats, the legal trap, I had learned something important. Fear only works when you show it. So I kept my voice steady. "These documents came from internal financial records of the Madden Ellsworth Foundation," I said. "They show over $1.2 million transferred as private loans to 2 individuals. My father slowly looked up from the papers. His expression had changed. Not panic, not anger, calculation. "You're misunderstanding internal financial management," he said coolly. "Large foundations move money between accounts all the time." "That may be true," I replied. I slid another document across the table. "But foundations usually don't move money into personal investment accounts." The lawyer picked up the page and studied it closely. This one showed the purchase of a lake house in New Hampshire. The down payment had been wired from the same account listed in the foundation's internal loan report. The lawyer's expression shifted slightly. My mother finally spoke. "You think this gives you leverage?" she asked quietly. I met her eyes. "No," I said. "I think it gives us all a reason to solve this problem." Silence filled the room again. For a moment, I wondered if my father might simply stand up and walk out. That was always his strategy when conversations stopped going his way. But instead, he leaned back in his chair. "What exactly do you want?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us, and suddenly I realized something surprising. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want money. I didn't even want an apology. "I want my life back," I said. The words came out more softly than I expected. "You drop the lawsuit. You cancel the debt claim. You withdraw the fraud complaint." I paused before finishing. "And you leave me alone." My father's jaw tightened slightly. "That's it?" "That's it." My mother leaned back in her chair, studying me with the same expression she used when evaluating donors during fundraising events. "You're bluffing," she said. "If those documents were real evidence, you would have already taken them to the authorities." For a moment, I didn't respond. Then I said something that surprised even myself. "I didn't come here to destroy you." That sentence seemed to echo in the room. Because it was the truth. Despite everything they had done to me, despite the legal threats and the humiliation of that dinner, I had come to this meeting hoping for one thing: peace. But my father simply shook his head slowly. "You're not thinking clearly," he said, "and you're underestimating the damage you could cause." I felt something inside my chest tighten. "Damage?" I repeated. "Yes," he said calmly. "If accusations like this became public, the hospital would suffer. Hundreds of employees depend on that institution. Patients depend on it." He leaned forward slightly. "You're not just attacking us, you'd be attacking everything this family built." For a moment, doubt crept into my thoughts, because part of what he said was true. The hospital wasn't just a building with our name on it. It was a place where people received care. Doctors worked there, nurses, researchers, patients. All of them could be affected by a scandal. But then another thought surfaced. They hadn't hesitated to destroy my career. They hadn't worried about consequences when they sent a lawyer to threaten my medical license. They hadn't shown even a moment of hesitation when they cut me out of their lives. So, why was the responsibility suddenly mine? I looked at the documents spread across the table, then back at my parents. "You already made your choice," I said quietly. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means I gave you a chance." I stood up slowly. "And now the decision is yours." The lawyer spoke quickly. "Perhaps we should all take some time to review these materials and reconvene." But my father raised a hand. "No." His eyes stayed locked on mine. "You won't do it," he said. "You won't expose your own family." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I picked up my bag. "Goodbye, Dad." I walked out of the conference room without looking back. 3 days later, the lawsuit against me was quietly withdrawn. The promissory note was canceled. The fraud complaint was never filed. But that wasn't the end of the story. 2 months later, a federal investigation was opened into financial practices at the Madden Ellsworth Foundation. I never publicly confirmed where the evidence came from. I didn't need to. The investigators had everything they needed. By the end of that year, both of my parents stepped down from their leadership roles. The hospital board announced a restructuring of the foundation. Within another year, the hospital itself was renamed. The Madden name slowly disappeared from the building that had once defined my entire childhood. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about what happened. The answer is complicated. I didn't destroy my parents' reputation. The truth did. But the most important part of the story didn't happen in courtrooms or board meetings. It happened 6 months later in a quiet hospital room. When I held my daughter for the first time, she was tiny, wrapped in a soft white blanket. And as I looked at her sleeping face, I realized something that had taken my entire life to understand. Family isn't defined by a last name. It's defined by the people who stand beside you when everything falls apart. Ethan was standing next to the hospital bed that day, holding my hand, and Liam was sitting in a chair nearby, proudly telling the nurse that he was now a big brother. In that moment, the legacy my parents had spent decades building suddenly felt very small, because the life I had built without them felt infinitely bigger. Sometimes, the hardest battles in life are not fought in courtrooms or hospitals, but inside our own families. This story was never really about money, reputation, or even revenge. It was about something much deeper, the moment when someone realizes they have to choose between living the life others designed for them or finally standing up for the life they truly want. For years, I believed that loyalty to family meant obedience. I believed that love had to be earned through success, sacrifice, and living up to expectations that were never really mine. But the night I walked away from that dinner table, I began to understand a different kind of truth. Real family doesn't disappear the moment you disappoint them. Real love doesn't come with contracts, conditions, or threats. Sometimes, losing everything you thought defined you is the only way to discover who you really are. And sometimes the life you build after everything falls apart becomes stronger than the one you were born into. If this story moved you, or reminded you that strength can come from the most painful moments, make sure to subscribe to Revenge Truth Vault. Here, we share powerful stories about resilience, justice, and the courage it takes to rewrite your own life, one story written on paper at a time.